She arrived at the military celebration in a worn-out cardigan, clutching a peculiar invitation. Half an hour later, the entire ship fell silent. Every sailor stood at rigid attention. No one knew who she was. Not yet. Moments earlier, she was being escorted off the USS Truman for breaching protocol. Moments later, senior officers were scrambling to undo a mistake. What happened during that small window of time? And how did a woman, a complete unknown to the crew, command such immediate respect? Some claimed it was a misunderstanding. Others suspected something much deeper was at play. Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to completely upend expectations? Keep watching. What follows doesn't just surprise you, it redefines what respect truly means. Harper hadn't been near a Navy ship in over 3 years. The last time she was this close to the USS Truman, she had been giving orders. Now, she stood on the edge of the naval yard, gripping a nameless invitation with unsteady hands. "I don't belong here anymore," she told herself, but she showed up anyway. The morning light stretched long shadows across the pavement as Harper Mitchell made her way to the entrance of the USS Truman. Each step seemed to make the invitation feel heavier in her calloused hands. The elegant cardstock bore the official Navy emblem and a single line requesting her presence at the ship's anniversary event. No sender, no reason, just a summons that felt like a whisper from the past, trying to pull her back into a world she had intentionally stepped away from. Compared to the stream of well-dressed attendees arriving in sleek luxury cars, Harper was clearly out of place. They came adorned in designer suits and sparkling jewelry, and Norfolk's upper crust treating the ceremony like another gala. In contrast, Harper's faded gray cardigan looked tired, its sleeves thinned from years of shelving books at the local library. Her plain jeans made her stand out among the crowd like a misplaced relic in a museum of affluence. But beneath her modest appearance, hidden in her old leather purse, was a small, weathered metal box, and in the way she carried herself a quiet, but purposeful was a trace of the discipline that no amount of time away could erase. At the security checkpoint stood Blake Morrison, exuding the smugness of a man who believed the world owed him applause. His Hugo Boss suit was flawless, his hair slicked back with an expensive sheen that caught the sunlight like polished chrome. At 32, the son of Norfolk's deputy mayor was used to being treated like royalty, and as head of security for the day, he relished the chance to flex his authority. Beneath that polished exterior was a man still clawing for his father's approval, wielding power not to serve, but to elevate himself. He was a man obsessed with standards, which usually meant reminding people like Harper that they didn't belong among Norfolk's elite. The moment he spotted her approaching in her worn clothes, his lips twisted into a grin that signaled he was about to enjoy himself at someone else's expense. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your invitation," Blake said, adopting the overly official tone of someone who watched too many crime dramas. His voice was thick with condescension, the kind usually reserved for unsolicited sales calls. Harper handed the card over without a word. Blake gave it the briefest glance before shaking his head with theatrical disappointment, as if her presence was a personal affront to the event. "I'm not seeing your name on the VIP list," he declared, drawing out the moment like a judge delivering a sentence. "This invitation might not be legitimate. We'll need to verify it. Please step over to the holding area." He gestured dismissively toward a small section cordoned off with rope, where a few puzzled guests already stood waiting. It was clearly his favorite part of the job, publicly asserting his dominance under the guise of following procedure. Harper didn't argue, she simply nodded and walked to the area he pointed to. But as she passed the welcome table, something made her stop, a detail most guests would have missed. There, on a gleaming display, sat a detailed scale model of the USS Truman, carefully arranged for guests to admire. Her eyes locked on it, her mind instantly registering something was off. Her hands moved instinctively, as if summoned by an old reflex from years past. The model's radar array was facing south, completely wrong. It should have been pointed northeast to avoid interference from local communication towers, a detail any competent naval officer would immediately recognize. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and adjusted the model with precise care, whispering to herself, "Radar needs to be northeast at 15 degrees to steer clear of Norfolk Tower signals." Nearby guests fell silent, turning to watch. The shift in their expressions was subtly but unmistakable. A flicker of curiosity, even respect, crept into their eyes as they realized the woman they dismissed might know more than they did. Blake, ever watchful, pounced on the opportunity to assert himself further. "Oh, perfect, now we've got a self-appointed Navy engineer," he said loudly, voice thick with mockery. His sarcasm drew scattered chuckles from those still watching, feeding his sense of superiority. But Harper looked up at him, her calm blue eyes steady as granite, and replied in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade. "I've walked these decks when no one else had the courage to." Her words lingered in the air, heavier than any insult Blake could muster, but inflated by pride and ignorance. He failed to recognize the warning in her tone. Blake failed to catch the quiet force behind Harper's words or the weight of what she had just implied. He didn't notice the tension in her voice or the subtle authority in her posture. Instead, he leaned into the silence, letting it hang in the air like a smug victory. The awkward pause grew longer, more pointed, and soon more devastating than any insult he could have delivered. A man in a tailored suit and a Rolex shook his head with a dismissive laugh. "Everyone's an expert these days thanks to YouTube and reruns," he muttered, loud enough to draw a few snickers. Blake smiled thinly and gave a complicit nod, choosing to remain quiet, understanding perhaps without fully realizing why that sometimes silence cuts deeper than sarcasm. Harper's grip tightened around the metal box inside her purse. Something hardened in her eyes, something that should have been a final warning. A subtle shift passed over her face, peeling back the quiet librarian exterior and revealing a far different woman, one forged in fire, tested in crisis, and victorious more times than most men could count. Blake Morrison had absolutely no clue that the woman he had just tried to humiliate had once stood at the helm of the USS Truman itself. That she had steered it through dangerous waters, commanded crews under pressure, and made decisions that had saved lives and changed missions. That she had once been saluted by officers far more decorated and respected than anyone present at this charade of an event. But all of that, her rank, her achievements, her battle essay was tucked away in silence, just like the metal box resting unseen in her purse. He saw only a middle-aged woman in outdated clothes. What he failed to see was a decorated leader who had faced moments of real consequence, moments far greater than the petty posturing of a man hiding behind a velvet rope and a guest list. The scale model of the USS Truman sat gleaming on the welcome table, immaculate, but wrong. Harper's eyes narrowed. The radar ray was angled southwest, a glaring inaccuracy that no competent officer would miss. It should have faced northeast, precisely 15 degrees. To avoid interference from the neural communications tower on the coast. Her body moved before her thoughts caught up. She stepped forward and adjusted the radar with practiced precision, her fingers recalling the maneuver like muscle memory from 1,000 inspections past. "Radar should be angled northeast to 15 degrees to avoid signal conflict from neural tower," she murmured, mostly to herself. The nearby guests turned, their idle chatter dying mid-sentence. They stared, uncertain how to process this display of technical expertise from a woman who looked like she belonged in a library-reading nook, not among naval brass. Blake, who had been watching her movements with hawk-like vigilance, seized on the moment. He grinned triumphant. "Well, would you look at that? We've got ourselves a radar expert," he announced loudly, his voice pitched perfectly to draw every eye in the vicinity. His tone dripped with condescension, a mix of theatrical disbelief and smug satisfaction. Gasps and chuckles followed, but Harper didn't flinch. She met Blake's stare, her expression calm, eyes steady and cold as steel. "I've walked these decks in conditions that made this yard look like a parade ground," she said softly. But the words carried a weight that silenced the gathering. There was no bluster in her tone, only memory, experience. Blake didn't recognize the warning. He didn't hear the unspoken history behind her voice. Instead, he misread the silence as surrender. Harper stood still, hand now gripping the small metal box in her purse like an anchor. Beneath the civilian clothes, the worn cardigan and faded jeans, something hardened in her posture. For a moment, the librarian vanished and the commander returned. Blake Morrison had no idea he had just poked at the edges of something far beyond his understanding. He saw only a spotlight, a platform, an opportunity. He stepped forward, phone already recording, He angled the camera to frame Harper, the model ship, and the crowd now drawn to the unfolding spectacle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, his voice deep with performative outrage, "this is what deception looks like, wrapped in sympathy and disrespect." The crowd fell silent, a hush of uncertainty and tension. Blake's voice rang out across the deck, carried on the self-righteous wind of someone convinced they were about to go viral for all the right reasons. The live stream chat lit up instantly. Viewers piled in with angry messages, outraged assumptions, and misguided patriotism. They didn't see Harper, they saw a villain invented by the lens. "She's faking it. She's stealing valor," another one trying to game the system. Blake basked in the digital affirmation, feeding off it like oxygen. Each comment emboldened him further. "This woman," he said, pointing directly at Harper without shame, "has been making false claims about naval procedures and attempting access to areas reserved for the families of real heroes." More murmurs. A few guests nodded in agreement, eyes narrowed in suspicion. One muttered, "Probably looked up Navy facts online," while another said with misplaced certainty, "This is disgraceful." But not everyone was convinced. Some in the crowd began to fidget, their expression shifting from amusement to discomfort. The performance was beginning to sour. Something about the cruelty, the sheer zeal of Blake's accusations, made them uneasy. And still, Harper didn't say a word. But her silence wasn't submission, it was restraint. And it was about to run out. Officer Davis fastened the restraint belt around his waist, following Blake's increasingly loud and insistent commands, though a sick feeling had already begun to spread through his gut like a slow, corrosive infection. Something about this wasn't right. Not by protocol, not by instinct. At 35, Davis had served 15 years in uniform, first in active duty, then in this civilian security role. He'd arrested actual threats to national security, apprehended criminals and foreign agents who posed real, tangible danger. But this woman, Harper, didn't fit any profile he'd ever been trained to watch for. She wasn't evasive, she wasn't angry, she wasn't nervous, or even remotely defensive. In fact, she exhibited the opposite of fear. She radiated calm, controlled presence. Not arrogance, not submission, just a broken bar certainty. Davis had restrained violent protesters, black market smugglers, even a rogue captain once, but he had never put cuffs on someone who looked like she'd earned more salutes than reprimands. When he finally reached for her wrists, Harper didn't flinch. She didn't plead or resist or demand to speak with someone in charge. Instead, she extended her hands in unhurried, steady, composed. It was the kind of poise that came not from indifference, but from experience, from having faced far worse than a crowd with phones and a man with a badge. Davis hesitated. His training screamed at him to reassess, but the procedure was in motion, and so, against his better judgment, he locked the restraints into place. She didn't take her eyes off Blake. The look she gave him, a cool, unwavering, sent a chill down Davis's spine. It wasn't the glare of someone caught in a lie. It was the gaze of someone who had once decided the lives of men like Blake with a signature and a steel resolve. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" she asked Blake, her voice level, not pleading, not angry, just final. The words weren't a question, they were a warning. But Blake, drunk on the sound of his own voice and the flood of praise pouring in from his live stream, heard only what he wanted to hear. He smirked and turned back to his phone. The restraint clicked shut with a cold, metallic snap that echoed across the deck. Harper didn't look away, didn't blink. No fear, no panic, only that same unshakable calm. It unnerved Davis more than if she'd shouted or cried, because now he was sure he'd made a mistake. As he began escorting her toward the ship's temporary security station, she spoke, low and precise, just loud enough for him to hear. "He has no idea what he just did to himself." The words hit him harder than any reprimand he'd ever received, because she didn't sound angry. She sounded right. And Davis suddenly wasn't sure this was a routine detainment at all. Something deeper was happening here, something the crowd couldn't see, and Blake was too arrogant to even imagine. Behind them, Blake continued his triumphant narration to the camera. The footage had already gone viral, spread like wildfire through social media. Hashtags multiplied. View counts soared. Comment sections flooded with outraging praise. The internet believed it was witnessing a hero unmasking a fraud. Blake basked in it. He was convinced he had done something nobly righteous, that he had protected the sanctity of military remembrance from an impostor trying to bask in reflected honor. Then a mug shattered on the ground. Admiral Thompson hadn't shouted. He had simply stood. 8 years ago, he had commanded the USS Truman with unwavering pride, but it was the 4 years after that when Harper Mitchell served as his executive officer that defined the man he had become. Her leadership, moral integrity, and tactical brilliance had not just shaped the crew while they had saved lives. She had saved his life. Watching her now escorted in restraints, surrounded by whispers, with Blake Morrison gloating to a digital MOBA felt like witnessing someone set fire to the flag while claiming it was patriotism. Rage surged in Thompson's chest, the kind of cold, righteous fury that made his hands tremble and his jaw clench, not at Harper, but at the injustice, at the blindness, at the disrespect. Blake Morrison had no idea who he had just humiliated in front of a nation, but he was about to find out. He remembered the fire drill in 2019, how she had rerouted the entire crew through smoke-filled corridors in under 4 minutes. No shouting, no chaos, just calm, decisive orders delivered with absolute authority. They obeyed her not out of habit, but because their lives depended on it, and she saved them. 73 lives. A catastrophic fire that could have destroyed the ship, and she'd stopped it, not with brute force, but with the kind of quiet, unshakable heroism most people only fantasize about in tales of valor and sacrifice. Now, that same woman was being humiliated on his ship. As Admiral Thompson stormed the decks, crew members stepped aside instinctively. No one questioned why. His footsteps echoed with the clipped rhythm of a man barely containing fury, each strike of polished dress shoes on steel a declaration of his urgency. His chest burned with a sickening cocktail of panic and rage. The consequences of this mistake were unthinkable, and if he didn't reach here to stop Thesa before it spiraled further, the fallout would be irreversible. He found Blake near the security checkpoint, standing like some victorious sentinel, phone still held high as he soaked in the praise pouring in from the internet, comments, likes, hearts, all of it for the public takedown of a woman whose service record these armchair patriots couldn't begin to comprehend. Morrison. The name cracked through the air like a rifle shot. Blake turned, startled by the sound and even more confused by the Admiral's expression atight with fury, eyes sharp with disbelief. "Admiral, sir." Blake straightened. "I've successfully handled a serious security breach." He gestured with the phone as if it were a badge of honor. "Caught a woman trying to enter the memorial zone with forged credentials and false claims about naval service. The video's already at over 50,000 views and climbing." He grinned, expecting praise, but the look on Thompson's face made that smile falter. The Admiral stared at him, stone still, as the reality of Blake's words sank in. The young man had no clue what he'd done, no understanding of the enormity of the insult he'd just delivered to someone who had served this country with distinction, with sacrifice. Thompson's voice dropped an octave, quiet, lethal, the kind of tone that made seasoned officers straighten and junior crew vanish. "What exactly did you do to that woman?" he asked, each word sharp and deliberate, cutting through the last wisps of Blake's self-satisfaction like a scalpel. Blake shifted slightly. Something about the Admiral's posture, his voice, made a doubt creep in, but his ego pressed forward. "I exposed a fraud, sir," he said, firmer than he felt. "She claimed naval service she clearly didn't have and tried to access a secure zone without proper clearance. I had her detained for trespassing." Thompson closed his eyes. It was only for a moment, but it was like someone bracing for the impact of an explosion he could no longer stop. And when he opened them again, his gaze had changed. The rage was still there, but colder now, sharper, the kind of anger that came from watching something sacred be desecrated by ignorance. "Take me to her, now." The words were soft, but they landed like a hammer. "And pray to whatever God you think might listen to that we can fix what you've done." They moved in silence, descending toward the ship's holding area. The walk felt like a funeral procession. Blake's steps slowed with growing dread as the glow of his victory dimmed under the weight of what he was beginning to suspect was a catastrophic mistake. Inside the cell, Harper sat composed, the same quiet strength radiating from her like armor. In her lap rested a small metal boxon untouched, undisturbed through the entire ordeal. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't pleaded, she hadn't needed to. When Thompson entered, he slowed his presence, shifting from command to reverence. There was something sacred about the moment, like he was stepping into a space that didn't belong to him. "Ma'am," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I need to ask you something I already know the answer to." She looked up, calm, certain. A flicker of recognition passed between them, subtle but unmistakable. "Do you still carry?" She nodded once. With quiet care, the box opened in her hands, emerging like a memory rising from deep, dark waters. Thompson stood straighter. Then, with visible effort, he saluted a perfect, but trembling. Harper returned his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw it, not anger, not bitterness, but the weary recognition of someone who had been through far worse and carried on anyway. Like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, the truth began to burn through the fog of ignorance and shame left in Blake's wake. With slow, deliberate care, Harper withdrew the worn metal box from her bag of emotion, reverent, as if she were handling something sacred, and in a way, she was. The box represented years of service, sacrifice, and the kind of quiet valor forged in blood, sweat, and steel. When Thompson saw it, he actually staggered back half a step before snapping to attention. His salute was flawless, so precise, so immediate, it stunned the room. Blake had never seen anything like it. Somewhere nearby, a champagne glass slipped from trembling fingers and shattered. A hushed voice whispered, "Wait." She was the Zo. Suddenly, no one was filming anymore. Phones lowered, mouths closed. Every eye was locked on the Admiral and the woman he was now saluting with visible, shaking hands. "Commander Mitchell," Thompson said, voice rough with emotion, "I offer my deepest apologies for everything that's happened here today under my command." His voice broke slightly, the weight of shame and regret crashing over him in relentless waves. Blake stood paralyzed, unable to reconcile the woman in front of him with the fraud he'd proudly detained. His mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be the same person. And yet, it was. Above them, the assembly whistle pierced the air, sharp and unmistakable, calling sailors to attention as it had for generations. All around the USS Truman, crew members and dignitaries gathered in response to Thompson's urgent announcement. He'd told them history was about to be made. And then Harper Mitchell stepped onto the deck, escorted by a full honor guard. She walked with a bearing that erased any lingering doubts. The quiet woman Blake had dismissed hours ago was gone. In her place was a leader, a commander whose stride spoke of storms weathered, orders given, lives saved. Her shoulders were squared, her gaze steady, her presence undeniable. Blake stood near the edge of the platform, frozen. His phone was still recording, but his bravado had vanished. He watched in numb disbelief as the woman he'd mocked for her cardigan and worn jeans transformed into someone who effortlessly commanded the respect of an entire warship. He didn't know what a Navy Cross looked like, but he knew he did not belong in the same room with someone who had earned one. Admiral Thompson approached the microphone, the solemnity of his movements mirroring the gravity of the moment. His voice rang out across the crowd, a clear, resolute, unflinching. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, crew of the USS Truman," he began, "it is my honor to introduce you to former Lieutenant Commander Harper Mitchell." She served as executive officer aboard this vessel from 2018 to 2022. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Audible gasps spread across the deck, murmurs of shock, heads turned, faces paled. People began to realize what they had just witnessed and what they had failed to stop. Thompson's words continued, cutting through the silence like a blade. 15 combat deployments, multiple commendations. On one mission, she pulled a wounded sailor across a burning deck barehanded. She has saved more lives than most of us will ever see in a lifetime of service. The crowd stood transfixed. Every word rewrote the narrative they had so casually accepted. Every detail exposed the terrible truth of what had been done to her and how easily they'd allowed it. Nowhere did the impact land harder than on Blake. He stared at the Admiral, then at Harper, horror dawning on his face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. His viral video streamed to millions hadn't captured a heroic act. It had captured a disgrace. He hadn't exposed a fraud. He had publicly humiliated a decorated officer, an American hero. And the world was watching. The comments on his live stream began to shift, the tide of public opinion turning faster than he could process. The broken bar SHE's the hero? That security guy just ruined his career. She saved 73 people, and he treated her like that? We applauded the wrong person. One VIP muttered under his breath. We honored the wrong man. Another quietly deleted the video from their phone. But it was too late. The damage was done. The internet would not forget. At the podium, Admiral Thompson turned back toward Harper. Gently, he opened the weathered metal box she had carried through every humiliation and insult. Inside lay the truth, the sacred tokens of service and sacrifice that no algorithm could rank, no live stream could diminish. The Navy Cross gleamed in Admiral Thompson's hand, a symbol of the highest valor the Navy could bestow. As the medal caught the late afternoon sun, it seemed to radiate its own light, casting a golden glow that shimmered with meaning. A hush fell over the crowd as the weight of its significance settled like a blanket of awe, of shame, of recognition long overdue. This, Thompson said, voice thick with emotion, is the Navy Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in the face of mortal danger, for actions that go far beyond duty, beyond fear, beyond self. He paused, letting the words sink in. Commander Mitchell never asked for praise, never sought to leverage her service for status or influence. She served with distinction, and when the uniform came off, she didn't chase accolades as she went home. To care for her dying mother, to put family above ambition, that, too, is a kind of bravery. Every sailor on deck raised a crisp salute. Hundreds of hands moving in silent unison, held firm for a full minute. Not 1 second of that tribute was wasted. It said everything words could not. Harper didn't bask in it. She stood still and steady, eyes forward, breathing through the moment like someone trained to endure storms. Each salute was a silent suture, stitching together the wound Blake had opened just hours earlier. Blake tried to step forward, babbling apologies, trying to explain what couldn't be explained. She didn't even glance his way. Her silence was absolute and devastating. It was the kind of silence that says, "You are no longer worth my voice." She turned instead to face the crew, while the men and women who had once served under her command, who now honored her with unflinching loyalty and unspoken reverence. And when she finally spoke, her voice rang with calm authority. It didn't need to be loud to command attention. "I didn't leave the Navy because I was weak," she began, "or unqualified, or afraid of pressure. I left because my mother needed me." And not all heroes fight wars. Some hold a hand through the final breath. The crowd stood frozen, every face turned toward her. "When people think you're no one," she continued, "they speak freely around you. That's how I learned just how little was expected of me." That silence, that dismissal, it weighs more than a uniform. There was no rage in her tone, just truth, and that truth shattered something in the room. The applause came like a wave, long, sustained, and thunderous. But even the sound couldn't drown out the brutal fact echoing in the minds of everyone present. Blake's live stream had already passed 2 million views. And it wasn't being celebrated. What began as his crusade to expose a supposed fraud had morphed into a digital reckoning. The video now served as a cautionary tally, shared and reshared as a searing indictment of arrogance, prejudice, and performative patriotism. Blake Morrison was fast becoming the most hated man in America, a walking symbol of everything wrong with snap judgment and social media outrage, the embodiment of casual cruelty cloaked in false righteousness. His world unraveled at hyperspeed. Job offers were rescinded, sponsors vanished, even his closest friends stopped replying. His phone buzzed constantly, but each notification was another nail in the coffin of his credibility. His mother texted him just one word: "Why?" He stared at that single word for hours, unable to answer. His father, the decorated colonel who had once taught him the meaning of honor, said nothing at all. The silence was worse than shouting. It was rejection without mercy. His apartment, once a symbol of success, now felt like a mausoleum. Every echo in the empty space reminded him of who he'd pretended to be and who he had humiliated in the process. Within a single day of Admiral Thompson's announcement, Blake's carefully curated life collapsed. The same platforms that had once elevated him as a patriotic watchdog now dissected him like a cautionary headline. The video, once his supposed triumph, had been seen by over 5 million people. Only now, it was studied not as proof of vigilancia but as a masterclass in public disgrace, a brutal lesson in how a single act of ignorance can obliterate truth, damage honor, and destroy a man's future while accidentally revealing the greatness of someone whose silence had always spoken louder than words. The fallout was swift and merciless. Blake Morrison became a public symbol of everything wrong with snap judgments, online mob mentality, and the kind of toxic masculinity that weaponizes humiliation for entertainment. His employer, a prestigious security firm built on discretion and sound judgment, terminated his contract without hesitation, desperate to sever all ties before the scandal scorched their reputation too. His name was now radioactive. Social media turned feral. Veterans, military families, and outraged civilians flooded his accounts with tens of thousands of furious messages. Many weren't just angry, they were heartbroken that someone like him had so casually tried to dismantle the reputation of a decorated war hero, left a bitter taste that wouldn't wash away. The psychological toll hit Blake hard. As the noise grew louder outside, a heavier silence fell inside. He kept hearing her words. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Not a threat, not a plea, just a quiet warning. One last open door. He had slammed it shut himself. Now he stood on the other side, alone, with no way back. Job prospects vanished overnight. Recruiters stopped calling. Mentors stopped replying. His name had become synonymous with ignorance, prejudice, and professional recklessness. No organization wanted their brand dragged into the wreckage he'd created. Late one night, unable to stand the weight of it anymore, Blake called his father. The phone rang 6 times. Voicemail. He couldn't bring himself to leave a message. What was there to say? That he finally understood honor wasn't about catching others in failure, that authority meant nothing without humility, that he'd learned these things too late. His father's silence said it all. No scolding, no lecture, just the absence of connection. Some lessons, Blake realized, you only learn when there's no one left to teach you. Meanwhile, Harper Mitchell had become a national name, not because she sought the spotlight, but because the truth she carried refused to stay hidden. The media chased her. They wanted tears. She didn't give them any. They wanted anger. She offered clarity. She simply told the truth, and it echoed louder than outrage ever could. Her interview on the nation's most watched morning show drew over 12 million viewers. Calm, composed, and unshaken, Harper stood as the embodiment of grace under pressure. And when the host finally asked the question everyone was waiting for, "Can you forgive Blake Morrison?" The moment stretched across living rooms and newsrooms, over breakfast tables and office cubicles. Everyone held their breath. Her answer would become one of the most quoted statements of the year. "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook," she said, looking into the camera with that same unflinching gaze that had once shaken Blake to his core. "It's about freeing yourself from the weight of hate. I don't forgive to help him, I forgive so I can keep helping others." Her voice grew stronger. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending actions don't have consequences. Accountability still matters. The country heard her, and it listened. For Blake, the hardest blow came not from strangers or headlines, but from the people whose opinions had once shaped his sense of self. His father finally called it, not with comfort, but finality. "You disgraced everything our family stands for," Colonel Morrison said, his voice heavy with disappointment and restrained fury. It was the voice of a man who had served his country with honor and couldn't understand how his son had come to embody the opposite. That conversation was brief and final. After Harper's interview aired and swept across social platforms like wildfire, Blake sat alone at his kitchen table and wrote her a letter. He obtained her address through a mutual acquaintance, someone who saw in him, perhaps for the first time, genuine remorse. The letter was short. No excuses, no self-pity, no PR spin. "I failed you. I see that now. I'll spend my life proving I understand what that failure cost, and not just to you, but to everyone watching." Weeks later, while volunteering at a local community center, part of an effort to rebuild his life in small, consistent acts. Another volunteer joked that someone should write a book about everyone's life story. For a moment, Blake almost replied, "I have one." But he didn't. He'd learned that redemption doesn't come from being heard. It comes from what you do when no one is watching. That night, he reopened the copy of the letter he had written to Harper. Then he quietly tore it up. He didn't need to keep proof that he'd once understood the depth of his failure. Some truths don't need to be preserved. They need to be lived. Blake was beginning to understand that there are mistakes you can never fully undo. Regret isn't always a path back, it's just a place you learn to carry forward, quietly, without applause, without absolution, just with the hope that one day, the weight becomes part of the work. There was no erasing the past. The footage lived on, not as a viral triumph, but as a case study in classrooms. A warning about what happens when prejudice dresses itself in patriotism and cruelty masquerades as conviction. Blake Morrison had become a cautionary tale, a lesson in what happens when power is used to humiliate rather than uphold dignity. 12 months after the incident that upended both their lives, Harper Mitchell had become a national symbol of quiet strength to grace under pressure, service without expectation, and dignity in the face of injustice. But Harper had chosen purpose over popularity. Instead of capitalizing on her fame, she redirected it. She turned the spotlight into a signal flare for others. Veterans from across the country began writing to her, sharing stories of being overlooked, dismissed, or misunderstood. One wrote, "You reminded us that our service matters, even when we feel invisible." Harper kept every letter in a box beside her desk, a reminder that healing doesn't erase the wound, but it can grow from it. With donations pouring in from those inspired by her story, she founded a nonprofit dedicated to helping veterans transition to civilian life. It quickly became one of the most effective organizations in the country. One man, who had been homeless for 6 months, now managed logistics for a tech firm. He still carried the library card she'd given him on his first day. Despite book deals, national speaking tours, and media offers that could have made her wealthy, Harper chose to stay at the Norfolk Public Library. Her salary hadn't changed, only her impact had. One Tuesday morning, a handwritten letter arrived. Plain paper, careful script. It was from the woman who had been in the crowd on the USS Truman that day. "I stood silent when you were being humiliated. I didn't speak up. I don't know why, but I'm learning to be braver now. Thank you for making me want to change." Harper folded it gently and placed it in the box with hundreds of others, each one a small reckoning, a delayed apology. Proof that pain, when acknowledged, could spark something better. She had transformed part of the library into a resource center for veterans, offering job training, resume workshops, counseling, and education programs tailored to those adjusting to civilian life. What started as a quiet effort became a model adopted in libraries across the country, a testament to what's possible when service is rooted in community, not ego. Blake, meanwhile, spent the past year learning to live without the privileges he had once taken for granted. His fall from grace had stripped away the illusion of status, leaving him to face the hard truth: respect must be earned. Unemployable in his former industry, he accepted a low-paying job at a small non-profit focused on community service. His first paycheck was a quarter of what he once made, but the work, while thankless and exhausting, began to reveal something he had never known: humility. The first veteran he tried to help met him with blunt words: "We don't need pity from privilege." Blake didn't flinch. Fair enough, he stood and kept showing up. He cleaned parks, served meals, sat with people who didn't care about his copyright but needed his time. It was the kind of work that couldn't be spun or polished. It just had to be done. What he didn't know was that the nonprofit where he worked was partially funded by Harper's foundation. She had specifically requested that her involvement be kept quiet. No recognition, no leverage, just quiet support from a distance. One afternoon at the library, Harper noticed a familiar face pinning job announcements on the Veterans Bulletin board. It was the same woman who had mocked her cardigan that day aboard the Truman. Now she was a weekly volunteer, helping veterans navigate complex benefit systems. Harper didn't say anything, just offered a small nod in passing. Some changes don't need applause, they just need space to continue. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, The moment Blake had both dreaded and hoped for finally arrived. Harper visited the Veteran Center to check on a new pilot program her foundation was funding. As she stepped into the main lobby, she and Blake locked eyes for the first time since everything had unraveled. The silence between them was heavy, and not with anger, but with memory. The air seemed to hum with all that had passed, the shame, the pain, the slow, stubborn work of repair. The fire had long since gone out, but the smoke lingered. The air between them carried the faint scent of destruction and regret. Blake didn't offer excuses or beg for forgiveness. He had long since learned that accountability doesn't come with qualifiers. No long speeches, no appeals for sympathy, just the hard truth. "I know I haven't earned your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I'm trying to become someone who might. One day." Harper studied him for a long moment. His face looked different now, aged not by time, but by effort, humility, and the cost of change. Then, in a voice soft but steady, she replied, "I'm not forgiving you to make you feel better." Her words hung in the air like a slow toll of a bell, deliberate, earned, and unflinching. "I'm doing it so I can move forward, but that doesn't erase what happened." Her tone shifted, stronger now, clearer. These were boundaries carved from reflection, not bitterness. Redemption isn't about feeling better about the damage you caused. It's about making sure no one else suffers the same way. 6 months later, Harper made an unannounced appearance at the Veterans Center's annual fundraising dinner. Blake was being quietly honored for his service to the organization. A small plaque read, "Volunteer of the Year A. Blake Morrison." She stopped beside it. She didn't smile, but she lingered. Later, during her brief address to the gathered donors, veterans, and community leaders, Harper spoke not about the posture but about what people do with the second chances they're given. "We all carry the capacity for both harm and healing," she said, her gaze drifting briefly to Blake. "What matters isn't whether we fight it, it's whether we learn from it, grow, and choose to use that knowledge to serve others." The story of Harper Mitchell and Blake Morrison became a powerful case study taught in business schools, leadership seminars, and military academies. A lesson in how prejudice can masquerade as authority, and how redemption, while rare, is possible for those willing to earn it the hard way. Harper's foundation continued to grow, helping thousands of veterans transition into meaningful civilian roles. Blake, meanwhile, remained quietly committed to his work in service. He had never chasing headlines, never seeking applause, just showing up, again and again. His actions became his apology. On board the USS Truman, a quiet space was set aside in Harper's honor. A reading room tucked near the old radar bay. No spotlight, no ceremony, just a display case holding her Navy Cross and a simple engraved inscription, a 7-word she had chosen herself. "Leadership is silent when it needs to be." The room became a place of quiet reflection for officers and sailors alike, a reminder that true heroism often comes not from rank, but from restraint, from integrity, from speaking up, or sitting down, when it matters most. The footage that had once threatened to dismantle Harper's reputation and Blake's future had become something more, a symbol of growth, of humility, of what it looks like to rise after falling. Their story echoed far beyond the ship, not because of a scandal but because it reminded people that the most ordinary-looking individuals often carry the most extraordinary strength. And that everyone, regardless of uniform, background, or appearance, deserves to be met with respect. Most of all, it proved something deeper still, that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and that real strength isn't found in punishing those who fail it but in helping them become something better.